Hello and welcome to my channel In Search of Wonder. My name is Anne and today I have thoughts. If you hear any banging, that's my neighbors. They're doing some work in their yard and I'm going to try and film this on my deck. As you can see, it's a little breezy, but I'm mostly concerned about the bugs. Last time I tried this, I got bit like 10 times. But hopefully, I'm wearing pants and socks and boots, so I'm hoping that there isn't any place for bugs to bite. So today I have thoughts about Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. And this video has been a long time in coming because I read this through the summer. Well, I started it in like April or May or something, and I finally finished it. I finished it before the end of the summer, so I think like at some point in August or something. And so I've been wanting to make a full-fledged, lengthy discussion of it, but I'm just now able to get around to doing that. So I did read it a while ago, so not everything is fresh in my memory. So if I say anything that is not factual, please forgive me. It's just bad memory on my part. And feel free to let me know in the comments. I know you will. So anyways, however, I will also say that everything I want to talk about here about Les Miserables is my thoughts and my opinions and the things that occurred to me as I was reading it. And a lot of what I think about this book, besides what is factually true, is my opinion. It's all relatively subjective to one extent or another. I'm not trying to say adamantly that this is what Victor Hugo had in mind when he wrote this. This is just what I saw on this read of it. This was my third read of the book, at least. I know for sure I had read it twice before. I had read the abridged version once, and I know that I had read the complete version at least once, maybe twice. So this was my third or fourth read of Les Miserables. And I was a little bit surprised as I was reading it this time around by how much my memory of the story had been connected to actually the musical, which sticks largely to the story that Victor Hugo tells, but also shortens it and truncates it. So the timeline is slightly different and some aspects of it are slightly different. I feel like the musical does a really good job of sticking to the basic storyline and Victor Hugo's themes and, you know, the representation of the characters in the story. But I do think it highlights some things that were more of passing ideas or necessary plot points in the book. And it doesn't necessarily highlight some other things that it seemed to me that Victor Hugo was actually trying to say. So my memories of the story were very much colored by the musical, and so as I was reading through it, I was like, oh, well, that didn't happen then, that happened here. Anyway, I was a little bit surprised by some of the things because I remembered it differently being used to the musical. So that was one thing that caught my attention as I was reading this past time. But there were some other things that really caught my eye and that I noticed on this read that I never noticed before. Number one, and I don't know how I missed it before, I don't know if it was because of the translation I was reading or because I just really wasn't paying attention when I read it before, or again, just the musical overshadowed my perception of everything, my understanding of everything. But I did not realize, by the way, there's going to be spoilers here. So let's just say that right now. If you haven't read Les Miserables and you don't like to be spoiled, then just stop right now and move on and come back to this after you've read it at some point. But if you're like me and you don't care about spoilers, or if you have read it, watch on. There's no way I can discuss it thoroughly without spoiling anything. So the first thing is that I learned on this read that Gavroche was the Thénardier's son. And I don't know how I missed that before because it's clearly stated in the text. Like it's not known when you initially meet Gavroche. It's kind of like implied and hinted at, but then it's like spelled out more than once after that. Somehow, like that just went over my head all the other times that I read it. So when I read it this time, I was like, what? Oh, how interesting. Kind of sheds a different light on some things. So anyway, that's something I caught on this reread. And there were some other things too that I noticed on this reread that I'd never noticed before. So first of all, let's talk about the setting. Les Miserables is set, a bulk of it is set in Paris. All of it is set in France. And it is set in the early part of the 19th century, mostly. It actually goes through several decades. And it actually kind of mentions within the course of the story the lifespan of more than one person. So it discusses things that happened from the last quarter of the 18th century into almost the middle of the 19th century. So it spans quite a lengthy bit of time. And it also is not strictly all set in Paris, but a large part of the story is set in Paris. Other parts are set in other areas of France. And a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that Les Miserables is about the French Revolution. But let's be honest, speaking from an outsider's perspective, I feel like the French Revolution kind of was like continuously revolving, if that makes sense. Like it was like a kind of an ongoing thing for many decades. And like there was just unsettledness in the French government for many decades. And so this book is the actual core of the action takes place, I think, in like the 1830s. So kind of on the tail end of all of that upheaval, and, you know, kings and queens, and then anarchy, and then Napoleon, and then kings and queens again, and then Napoleon again, and then, you know, it's like going back and forth. It's kind of on the tail end of all of that stuff. So that's where we are in this story. There is an insurrection in this story. So it's not the actual revolution that we think of, the French Revolution that happened in the late 18th century. It's a minor insurrection similar to ones that took place later on in the 19th century. Now, Victor Hugo is definitely, and this is where some of the confusion might come in, Victor Hugo is definitely sharing his thoughts and political views about the revolution in all of its stages and all of the aspects of the upheaval in the French government in that whole time. He definitely has thoughts, and he discusses those thoughts at length. And although, to be honest, I don't love politics, especially the politics of other countries, and it's just not a topic that I understand readily and enjoy. So to be honest, I mentally, like, I mean, I read every word, but I mentally skimmed some of that because it wasn't a particular interest to me. So if you're here wanting to hear an in-depth analysis of any of that kind of stuff, you are in the wrong place. I'm much more interested in the relationships and the overall themes that Victor Hugo was showing up the actual story, and not so much about what he was trying to say politically. He definitely had political thoughts, and that was definitely being brought out in this story, but that was not really my concern in reading it as a reader. So this is my subjective view of the more relational aspect of the story. So yeah, there's a lot of political stuff going on. There's a lot of French Revolution stuff, but the book itself is not necessarily about the French Revolution per se. It is not set during the actual revolution. It's in the succeeding years after that. Now, the characters. There are a lot of characters. I mean, to go in depth about all of these characters, this video would be like an hour and a half long, because there are just so many characters in the book, and they all intersect and they all intertwine, and so many of their stories are important to the overall story he's telling. But essentially, there are two generations whose stories are being shared in this book. And the first generation is the main character, who is through the whole story, and we get his whole entire life story, and that is Jean Valjean. He is the central focus of this book and the main character. So Jean Valjean is the first one and the most important one. And then you have his counterpart, I guess, and that is Thénardier. Thénardier being his last name. I forget the moment what his other name is, but Thénardier was his last name. And then we have the bishop, who he's the one character who opens up the story, and we begin with the bishop, but he doesn't stay around for long. At the beginning of the story, he is an older man, but he plays a crucial, pivotal part in the story. And then we also have Javert, who pops in and out of the story at a few crucial moments. Again, he is an important person in the development of the plot and in the discussion of what Victor Hugo is trying to say, but he doesn't have a lot of on-page time. And then you have Fantine, who is of the same generation, and her story, again, is towards the beginning of the book, and it's brief, but it's crucial and pivotal in the storyline. Then we have the second generation, and Cosette is Fantine's daughter. And then there is Eponine and Gavroche, who are the offspring of Thénardier and his wife, Madame Thénardier. And then we have Marius and all of his friends, who are the insurrectionists, or who are part of the insurrectionists in the story, not the only ones. There are many other characters that are brought into this book, but those are really the main ones that tell the story. So let's see if I can summarize what actually happens in the story, the plot, as succinctly as I can, which, you know, for me is hard, but I'm going to try. So I'm going to tell you from the context of Jean Valjean, because every single character in the book interacts with Valjean on some level or other. And the story is ultimately Jean Valjean's story. He is definitely the main character. So Jean Valjean, we find out, the story starts a little bit later in his life, but we find out that at some point, as a young adult or maybe an older teenager, he steals some bread to help his family survive. I believe it was his sister and her children. They're starving, they're poor, they have no recourse. So he steals some bread to feed them. Well, he's caught and imprisoned, and from that point, he tries to escape multiple times, and then his punishment is compounded because he's trying to escape. And so in the end, his imprisonment is much longer than it should be, based on the minor crime of shoplifting, essentially. In his prison experiences and the hard labor that he endures as an inmate, his heart becomes very hardened and bitter, and it makes him into the criminal that he is seen as. And eventually, he's let out on parole, but he finds that people are still very suspicious of him because his heart is hard, you know, and he's been in prison his entire adult life. Like, he doesn't know how to interact in public, and so people are scared of him, honestly, for good reason in some ways. So he resorts to actual stealing again. It looks like he is bent on a life of actual crime, but then he meets the bishop. Now, the bishop is an interesting character because I think he is representing the church in the story, but he is representing a very idealized version of the church. In fact, I think that he is representing more like the person of Jesus Christ, maybe, on the earth, and in all of his self-sacrifice and giving of everything that he has. It's a very unrealistic portrayal of an actual person, because the bishop behaves in such a way that he has no sense of self or self-preservation. He is intent on giving everything that he has to the benefit of other people and sacrificing completely everything of himself for other people. And that's one reason why I say he very much seems representative of Jesus Christ. And definitely in his character and in his lengthy discussion about the bishop and his activities and his points of view, etc., and his history, Victor Hugo is definitely indicting the church in France for their obsession, maybe, I don't know if that's quite the right word, with wealth, and the way that they use the wealth that they have and the way that they obtain their wealth. And he's definitely criticizing the church for their lack of empathy towards the people in France who are members of their church, and the even criminal activity that the church engages in. And he is doing that by having this bishop character who is exactly the opposite of all of that, in contrast. So the bishop is really an interesting person, kind of an exaggerated caricature of what a really good bishop actually might be. But I think also, I say exaggerated caricature, but really I think he's like the ultimate good in what a person in that position could be if they were truly Christ-like in all of their interactions. And it's imperfectly drawn because it's imagined by a human. And so, you know, we might quibble over some of his decisions and whatever he does. But I think that's what Victor Hugo's going for. In my opinion, that's what I saw this time around. And so Jean Valjean has an encounter with the bishop. And this encounter with him leads ultimately to essentially what is a conversion experience. And what prison failed to do in Valjean's life, the church is able to do via the bishop and his act of mercy and grace towards Jean Valjean. And so from that point, Jean Valjean begins a new life. And it's completely like, it's like symbolically, it's like he dies to himself and becomes a new person. And he gets a new name, he moves to a new town, and he is, in a way, born again. And so he starts all over, and he becomes the mayor of this town. And prior to becoming a mayor, he invents this device that makes it easier to manufacture the items that town is famous for making, and makes it even easier to mass produce this. I forget what it was. And so he becomes wealthy and then becomes the mayor of the town. And he's just a really good man and is well respected and well loved in that town. And he becomes very wealthy. One of his factory workers, Fantine, she is fired from the factory by the manager, not by Jean Valjean. Like, he doesn't really even know her. Like, he wasn't involved in that decision. But she is fired, and so she's destitute, and she is trying to support her illegitimate daughter, who is boarding at the Thénardiers in some couple towns away, or, you know, a little bit away from there. I don't know, maybe like 50 miles. I don't know how far away it is, but it's not real close. But her daughter is living with the Thénardiers, and she is sending them money. But the Thénardiers are crooks through and through, and they're always looking for a quick buck. And so they are constantly pressuring and hounding Fantine for more money for her daughter, saying that she's sick and she needed this and she needed that and she needed that, so you need to send more money. So they are, however, just fleecing her, and they are just taking that money and using it for themselves, and not a dime of it goes to Cosette, actually. Fantine doesn't know this, of course, and so she's desperate to earn money to help her daughter and to, you know, pay for doctor's visits and medicine, whatever that they say she needs. And so in the end, she prostitutes herself, and she sells, you know, her hair, and she sells her teeth and all of this stuff. She's just in really bad straits, and she's very ill when Jean Valjean comes across her. And when he finds out that she had been fired from his factory, he just feels guilty for that, even though it wasn't his decision. And he takes her in and provides medical care for her. In the end, she passes away. But before she passes away, she makes Jean Valjean promise that he will go and take care of her child, Cosette. Now, while all of this is happening, this is one of the crucial moments of the story, like pivotal plot points. Javert comes on the scene. Now, Javert had known Jean Valjean back when he was in prison, so he knew him as an inmate. Now, so much time has gone, and his name is different. Javert doesn't recognize him right away, but he begins to have a suspicion, and then he begins to realize that this man, who's not going by the name Jean Valjean in this town, seems to bear a strong resemblance to Jean Valjean, the prisoner, who had escaped parole. And so this is all like tightening around Jean Valjean at the same time, but he manages to go to get Cosette, and he realizes when he goes to the Thénardiers that is not a permanent situation for Cosette, and that she needs to be taken from that home and taken care of. And there's no one else to go to but himself, so he decides that he must do that. And so he manages to evade Javert, and he rescues Cosette, but he also at the same time finds out, like, all this is happening like really quick, and I can't remember the exact sequence of it, but somewhere in there also Javert thinks someone tells him that they have found prisoner 24601, which was the tattooed number that Jean Valjean had. But apparently some mistake had been made and someone else had also been tattooed with that number. And that person was accused by others of being Jean Valjean. And some elements of his story kind of lined up with Jean Valjean's life history and stuff. So an assumption was made that this guy was Jean Valjean. And so this guy was brought to trial in, a neighboring town. So Jean Valjean actually, he wrestles with the question of what to do at this point. And in the end, he decides to go to the trial and reveal himself as the true Jean Valjean. So he does the right thing. And this is an aspect of the story that's a little bit convenient, shall we say. But he manages, nobody does anything. He goes to the trial and he makes this announcement that he is Jean Valjean, not the guy who is on trial. And he gives them some proof of it. But nobody does, they're just kind of dumbfounded and nobody does anything. So he's like, okay, well then bye. And so then he goes on to get Cosette and then he disappears. Then once they look into his story and they realize, he actually was Jean Valjean, then they start in earnest looking for him. By that time he was long gone and he manages to escape them. And he ends up in a convent in Paris with Cosette. So he builds a new life with Cosette. We'll skip a lot because we've already spent a long time and we're coming towards the end of the story, but this is the middle-ish of the story. So he ends up raising Cosette in this convent, and there's a lot of other stuff that happens. There's a lot that goes on here, but suffice it to say, when Cosette is a little bit older, for a variety of reasons, they end up leaving the convent and then kind of disappearing into Paris. And he has a couple of different apartments in Paris or houses where he lives. He'll live 6 months here, 6 months there, whatever, and kind of rotates between these houses with Cosette and with a housekeeper. And so Cosette grows older, and then the story kind of culminates at a point where there's an insurrection in Paris. And just prior to this insurrection, in a sort of interesting way and highly unlikely, Cosette meets Marius, and their paths cross, literally, and they just see each other for a while, and they fall in love just seeing each other, not interacting with each other at all, but just seeing each other, which was a little bit silly, to be perfectly honest. But they fall deeply in love with each other. And so, but there's several years pass between the time when they first meet and the time when they actually end up really meeting and exchanging names. And then there's even some more time that passes before they are able to actually get married. So, but for the last 10 to 15% or whatever of the story, they are married. Cosette and Marius are married. A lot of this story is, the insurrection takes up a lot of the story and is a crucial point in what is happening, what is going on in the characters' lives, and everything kind of culminates there at that insurrection, and all of the characters who are still alive at that point kind of intersect there, and things happen. So it's really crucially important, the insurrection itself. But for the purpose of the story, we're just kind of gloss over that. For the purpose of the summary, we'll just gloss over that. Move on to the aftermath of that, is that Marius is very badly wounded and ends up recovering. Marius and Cosette end up together. And Jean Valjean does not want to inflict his past on Cosette's future. And because Marius comes from a family with some standing in the social hierarchy of France, Jean Valjean doesn't want to cast any bad light on her being a former criminal who's living in hiding. He's never told her anything of her true story. So he purposely fades out of her life. And then the very end of the story is Jean Valjean's passing, but he doesn't pass on before there is a complete resolution with him and Cosette and Marius, and all of the things that had been secrets are revealed and made known to Cosette and Marius, and they understand all of Valjean's past and are able to move forward, and that's the end of the story. So That's the story. That's the plot line. But what is Victor Hugo trying to say in this story? And this is one of the things where my view of Les Miserables had largely been affected by the musical. Because in the musical, they are essentially setting up Jean Valjean and Javert as protagonist, antagonist. And that Jean Valjean is the criminal and Javert is trying to catch him. And that is true. But actually, on this reread, I saw it differently. This time I saw that Victor Hugo was comparing and contrasting not Valjean and Javert, but Valjean and Thénardier, because he made much of the fact of Jean Valjean being a criminal, although the actual crimes that Valjean committed existed only in stealing a loaf of bread, stealing a coin, and running from the law because he ran away from parole. Those are the only crimes he actually committed. And he repented of both of those and was, spending his life making restoration for those crimes. But in his mind, he always saw himself as a criminal. And that is how the world saw him also, as a criminal. Even though you as the reader know differently, that's how he is portrayed. And then Thénardier is undeniably a criminal through and through, 100%. Like, everything he does is criminal, illegal, unethical, immoral, gross and disgusting and awful. So Thénardier is just a bad guy. He's a horrible husband, horrible father, horrible person. And so we're comparing and contrasting these two men who are both criminals and the effects on them of the law, how the law changes or doesn't change them, how the law sees them, and grace. So Jean Valjean, in the hands of the law, is seen imperfectly. Like, the law is not able to see him perfectly. The law is not able to understand his motives or judge his motives, only his actions against their standard. And then grace, or the church, or Jesus Christ, however you want to look at it, in the person of the bishop, acts on Jean Valjean in such a way as to change him completely. So he becomes a totally different person when he accepts the grace that is offered to him by the bishop and the mercy that is given to him by the bishop. He allows that to completely change him and make him a new person. And as long as he is that new person, that is what the world sees, and that's what he's judged by. But whenever it is revealed that he is actually Jean Valjean, the old man, then the law is always there to judge that. But he himself is changed by grace. Thénardier, however, is just, as a reader, you understand that he is a criminal through and through. And yet, somehow he manages to fleece everybody around him. Somehow he manages to evade the law on many occasions. There is one point in the story where he is caught and briefly imprisoned. He hardly ever suffers any consequence, not like Jean Valjean did for his minor little crimes that he did. Thénardier rarely suffers any legal consequences. Now, there are consequences in his life. I mean, galore. He has zero actual relationship with anybody in his family. He's poor as all get out, lives a hand-to-mouth existence, even though he's always trying these get-rich-quick sort of things and trying to get money from other people or whatever. But the law is completely unable to change him and make him a better person. He just skirts around it and he does what he wants. And at the end of the story, he's the same as ever he was, and there is no hope for him, and there is no hope for redemption or change in the person of Thénardier at all, because he has zero interest in any kind of grace or righteousness or mercy being applied to him. And he certainly has no desire to be shaped or affected by the law either. So he is always at odds with the law, but never changed by it. And so there is that definite contrast between a person who is seen as a criminal, but isn't, and has been changed by an act of love and mercy. And then you have Thénardier, who is just continuing in his unlawfulness and is never changed or shaped by anything. But at the same time is not always seen for being the criminal that he is. Like he can fool people into thinking he's actually a decent guy. And so Jean Valjean is definitely contrasting these two characters and pitting them against each other, and they have the most page time of anybody else in the story. We go back and forth. Now, we visit with other characters throughout the story as well, with Marius, with Gavroche, with Eponine, with the bishop, with all of them. But back and forth between Valjean and Thénardier the whole way through the story, like viewing them like from this angle and from this angle, from this angle and from that angle, and they form the bulk of the story. And then Cosette is the offspring of this Grace. Now, she is not Valjean's actual child. And actually, she was conceived in sin, if you will, because she was born out of wedlock. And her mother ended up having to prostitute herself to survive. And she was living initially with the Thénardiers. But because of the grace that Valjean accepted through the bishop, then he extended the same to Cosette, and he rescued her from that life. And she becomes like, the embodiment of, like goodness and beauty. She's a little bit dim-witted, for lack of a better word. But she is like intrinsically like a good person. And then you have Eponine, who is the offspring of Thénardier, who is evil to his core. And she's just like, she's just lost. Like, you really have a lot of empathy for her because she's lost and she's at a loss. Like, she lacks direction. She has these desires for a better life, but no idea like how to get there and no road to get there. And her story ends up being very tragic, as is Gavroche. So the offspring of this evil of Thénardier ends up being death and destruction, and it's horrible and it's tragic, and it's very wonderfully told in that it really pulls on your heartstrings, and you have a great deal of empathy for Eponine and Gavroche, who grew up in this environment of chaos and destruction and thievery and the influences that were on them and the negligence that they experienced and the lack of love, even the hatred that was directed at them. Yeah, their part of the story is really very sad. So I feel like in the story, so you have, like I said, the musical puts Jean Valjean and Javert as being like protagonist, antagonist. But I think, like I said, it's actually Valjean and Thénardier. But the bishop and Javert are kind of like the bookends. And so the bishop is representing grace, and it's changing power on a person's life. And Javert is representing the law and the inefficacy of the law to affect change in a person's life. Either in a criminal's life, like Thénardier, for example, or in his own life, in Javert's life. Javert, if Bishop is a caricature of grace, like an exaggeration of grace and mercy, like embodied in a person, then Javert is an exaggeration of justice in a person, and only justice. So the two are not combined in one person. Like, here is an exaggeration of mercy and grace. Here is an exaggeration of justice and the law and legalities. And Javert is so consumed by what is right and what is just that he cannot come to terms with any act of mercy or grace. And when Jean Valjean And when Jean Valjean extends grace and mercy to other characters in the story, which he does in a regular basis, and especially to Javert himself, Javert cannot understand this. He cannot grasp it. He cannot accept it. He doesn't understand it. And in the end, he dies because he kills himself because he can't grasp the grace that is extended to him. And I really feel like it's a beautiful and graphic representation of the limits of the law in a person's life, and that trying to live by the law and the legality is death in the end. And yet living by mercy and grace is where true life is found. Not without its difficulty, but that's where true life and goodness and beauty are found. And so it is a very, very richly Christian story from beginning to end, in my opinion. And I have always known that about it, but this time reading it through, I saw it more clearly in the way that Victor Hugo was presenting it, with the characters of the bishop and Javert being contrasted, rather than contrasting Valjean and Javert. Like, contrasting the bishop and Javert was just a little more clear-cut for me. I will say, as I was reading through the book, until about 75 to 80, maybe even 85% of the way, I was thinking to myself, I've always given this book 5 stars every time I've read it before, but I'm feeling 4 stars. Victor Hugo goes into some really deep tangents, rabbit trails, about political things, historical things. He loves to drop names of political characters, celebrities, authors, etc. of the day. Names that nobody remembers now. Back then, they probably knew who he was talking about, but us reading, even professionals who know these subjects, don't know who some of these names are he's talking about. They're real names, they're real people, but we don't know anything about them. He's name dropping all over the place. He's going on to tangents about, there's a whole lengthy section detailing the Battle of Waterloo and the location where the battle took place and the results of the battle, and analyzing the battle itself and the things that went into play in the battle and what it affected in the war after that, etc. Huge diatribe on that. And then there's a huge section about the sewers of Paris, and there are other there's a chapter about slang and slang in a language and all of this stuff. That one was kind of interesting, but honestly, in my opinion, you can skip those tangents because they're interesting, but they're like essays in the middle of a fictional story. They kind of interrupt it, in my opinion. And I know that not everybody agrees with me. That's okay. But that was my opinion reading it. I feel like we can do without those personally. I was thinking like 75 to 80 or 85% of the way through the book. I was like, this is more like a 4-star for me. Like, it's good. Like, it's really good writing, but there's just so much detail that seems completely unnecessary. And there are these tangents and whatever. Like, I don't know. I'm not feeling the 5-star here. But then just push through to the end. The end makes everything worth it that came before it. And I can't even explain really to you why that is. I just know when I got to the end, I was sobbing, and I was like, I was here for it. I was gripped by it, and it was so emotional, and it kind of tied everything together so beautifully and perfectly and wrapped up the whole story in such a beautiful bow, into such a beautiful package, that I was like, okay, 5 stars. Okay, you still get 5 stars from me. So in my opinion, it's still a 5-star book. So in the end, that's where I left it. I love what Victor Hugo is saying in this story. I love the character of Jean Valjean, and I loved the representation of grace and the change that it can effect in a person's life. And truly, it's a beautiful story, and definitely worth every moment of time that it took to read it over the span of several months in my life. And also, the musical is totally worth your time if you happen to have never seen the musical. Definitely worth listening to. It's really well done and a beautiful adaptation of the story. It's not obviously an exact replica of the story, because it's a different format and there's limitations in that, but it's really so well done from a musical standpoint, from a literary standpoint. I really love a musical. So highly recommend that. And I highly recommend the book itself, Les Mis. And I'm curious to know what your thoughts are, if you've ever read it, if you enjoyed it. What do you think about Victor Hugo's tangents? Do you think that they are essential to the enjoyment of the story? Or do you think readers can skim by those or skip them entirely without losing any element of the story? Who is your favorite character in Les Mis, if you have read it? And do you agree with my analysis of what Victor Hugo is trying to say in this story? And I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.